These are the best houses on the market in Chicago from every decade. First up, 1870s. This is a house in Irving Park. It was built in 1871, right after Irving Park had been subdivided from farmland into residential development. This was built about 18 years before Irving Park was incorporated into the city of Chicago like the rest of Jefferson Township. Now, I love this house because it is a classic Italianate style, almost rural farmhouse look. It has these bracketed eaves, which were a staple of the era, this cupola up top on the roof, covered porch, and this side bay with more bracketed details. Now, whoever bought this and built this in the 1870s probably didn't think that there was going to be a massive 8-lane highway running through the center of this neighborhood about 100 years after it's built, but here we are, 1880s. When people think of Bronzeville, I think they think it's one neighborhood, but really Bronzeville is made up of sections of other defined Chicago community areas like Douglas, Oakland, parts of Grand Boulevard, and parts of North Kenwood. This house we're looking at on Giles Street is in the Douglas section. But what people may not know is that all of this section of Bronzeville known as Douglas was filled with these 1880s beautiful limestone brick Victorians. And this is a perfect example that has seen better days. What makes it so remarkable is because it hasn't been touched in so many years, it retains so many of the original features. We have super tall, probably 12-foot ceilings. We have this multi-tiered molding throughout, plaster throughout. These are all the original wood floors, for better or worse. This mahogany railing walking up the stairs, and all of these decorative plaster reliefs in the center of each room. Now, this is no easy project, getting this to look like it originally did 140 years ago. To get this house up to snuff, I cannot imagine it costing less than $600,000 to $700,000. But hopefully someone picks this up before it ends up in demo court and gets torn down. 1890s. We're going over to Ukrainian Village to look at this classic workers' cottage. Now, these come in all shapes and sizes and had really been built in one form or another from right after the Chicago fire to around 1910. This was probably the dominant form of single-family home in Chicago. This is a really unique example because like most workers' cottages, it's a 1.5-story house, but it has this great front bay window. This house has been heavily renovated, but I think the owner did a good job of maintaining a lot of the things that we really love about these houses. The window trim, the floors, and base moldings look to be original, and if they're not, they did a great job replicating that Victorian look. Some of the built-ins from the original house are still intact. The trickiest thing with workers' cottages in today's standards is making that second half-story livable. Now, this owner or a previous owner opted to dormer out the side to make the middle bedroom functional up there, and the front and back bedrooms are sitting underneath the original roof structure. 1900s. All right, we're going to Rogers Park for this one. Like Irving Park, Rogers Park was an area that was at the fringe of the city and was primarily farmland up until around the 1870s. When the area was subdivided, owners took a lot of care of making lots a lot larger than they were in areas that were in the city of Chicago at the time to the south. The lot is 150 deep, 63 on the side, and 32 in the front. It is a beast. It is a classic American Foursquare, which, if you guys know, were a very popular style around the turn of the century. In fact, you could buy all the components of a house like this from Sears and then call up your cousin and spend a couple weekends hammering everything together. Now, I don't know if this is a Sears house or a catalog house, but it is a classic 1900s American Foursquare. It's got this great enclosed porch, which I'm sure was open at one time. It's coated in stucco, which was a very popular material of the day, although impractical in Chicago's climate. One of the few things that were influenced in our housing stock from the West Coast. And this massive 4-car garage, which I have a suspicion might have been a stable based on the year that this house was built, the 1910s. Next, we're going to East Lakeview to show you a home built in 1915. This is an absolute mansion. Now, Chicago had had its fair share of really large-scale homes being built. This would have been the first generation that they'd been built this far north at this scale. Really, the South Loop, and in particular the Prairie Avenue district, was the first district to pop off with these great grand Victorian mansions after the Chicago fire. But East Lakeview in the 1915s would have been primarily lived in by middle to upper middle class families that lived in these really famously large 3-bed plus apartments. So this is a 14,000 square foot house with a 2,400 square foot coach house in the back. There's 11 bedrooms, there's 7 full bathrooms, 3 half bathrooms. It is a beast. It is built like a tank. It's one of the very few houses in Chicago that you're going to find from this era that have concrete between the floors, both for structural and for sound protection. The main level of the house has 15-foot ceilings. It is wood-paneled library. It's all of the glory you'd expect from a Chicago titan of industry, almost intact from how it would have been 110 years ago. The 1920s. Okay, so the 1920s in Chicago, and really in Chicagoland, which was then just Chicago and its near streetcar suburbs, really belongs to the bungalow. Now, the bungalow had several iterations, starting with these small sort of frame stick-built homes right around 1910 to 1915, really followed the sort of the arts and crafts guidelines. Then they sort of got more codified in the late 1910s, early 20s into kind of what you would think when you think about a bungalow. Flat front, 1.5 stories, brick with a half-story second level unfinished, basement unfinished. That's how they would sell. Chicago has 80,000 of these types of homes in the city and in the near suburbs. Now, by the end of the bungalow's sort of stylistic run, we started to see a lot more experimentation with the form, and I think this house is a great example of it. This is in Oak Park, one of Chicago's near suburbs. It has a lot of the accoutrements of the day you'd expect in like a Hollywood-type mansion. It's got this terracotta tiled roof. It has these windows with these wonderful archways, textured plaster walls, I'm sure were in this house at one time. Now, these houses are sometimes called jumbo bungalows or jumbalos. Try saying that 10 times fast. The house is in immaculate shape, tons of original woodwork, but updated in a really gracious way. 1930s. Now, Chicago, in the housing market in particular, were hit really hard by the Great Depression. We saw very, very little new ground-up, new construction homes being built in the 30s in both the city of Chicago and the suburbs. This is a notable example because this was a retrofit of a old Victorian, probably graystone, built, if I were to guess, in the late 1880s. Now, an architect bought this for himself. His name was James Eppenstein. He tore off the face of the building. He coated it in concrete block, and he added this band of casement windows, which is sort of really indicative of the international style of the day. If you think about Corbusier or other architects that were working in Europe at the time, it's closer to a house you'd see there than certainly of the Chicago vernacular. I think it's exceptionally cool. It went through another heavy renovation in the early 90s, which are where most of the finishes today are, but it still sort of has that art modern Bauhausy quality to it. There's curved railings. There is that reeded glass door, which was kind of a staple of Bauhaus, using these industrial materials in sort of a high design language. And it has this great walled courtyard in the back. Now, if you guys know about the single-family home market in the Gold Coast, you know one of the biggest complaints that we deal with from buyers is the fact that these homes don't have alley access for parking. This house does have alley access, but there's no garage. So there is no parking on site, which I suspect is the reason that it's still sitting on the market. 1940s. This house is what's called a Georgian, I think because it is supposed to reflect houses from the era of King George in England. Do they look like that? I don't know. Now, Chicago experienced another building boom in the 40s after World War II with a sort of mass influx of GIs coming back home, starting families. Georgians are a really popular style from this era. This is a great example of one in North Park. It has an attached garage, which would have been a total novelty whenever this was built. Now, I suspect this was probably added after the fact based on the material, but if not, this would have been the height of immediate post-war living in Chicago. The house has been updated and added onto over the years. What was very common in Georgians was to add a back room off the dining room, have that be a den. These types of houses have living rooms and dining rooms, but to have this third space for leisure was a new sort of novel thing for middle-class Americans who by and large bought these types of homes. 1950s. So I think a lot of people, when they think of the 50s, they think about suburban sprawl. They think about those black and white educational type videos of showing families driving around in those big Chevy boats between suburban developments. Now, what people maybe don't think about are these really, really design forward mid-century modern homes that we've really become to love so much. And this is a really great example of that. This is situated in a town called Wayne, Illinois, which is just on the fringes of Chicagoland, that I imagine was probably near completely undeveloped when this was built in the 50s. It is a classic mid-century design by Paul Schweiker. Features that sort of post and beam type of interior design you would see or maybe associate with Japan via California. Big, huge panels of glass looking out into the wooded surrounds, and these interior courtyards that sort of act as light wells for rooms that are in the center of the home. It is incredibly well designed by the architect Paul Schweiker, who is amongst sort of our most beloved mid-century architects in the Chicagoland area. 1960s. In the 60s, one of the major concerns of the Chicago top brass was our population starting to leave the city for the suburbs, a trend that had sort of begun after World War II and reached its apex in the 1980s in Chicago. One of the big grand ambitions of Chicago leadership in the 60s was what's called slum clearance, blight clearance, or otherwise known as urban renewal. Like Douglas that we mentioned earlier, where big swaths of these 1880s row homes were torn down and replaced with high-rises called the Lake Meadow and Prairie Shores development. The area to the east of Old Town was called La Clark. It was a primarily Puerto Rican neighborhood up until the 1960s. Chicago had used sort of its strong-arm tactics that were a lot more prevalent in the mid-century to seize that land, tear it down, and we're talking about a big swath of land from Division Street all the way up to North Avenue between LaSalle and Clark. Tear that all down and build what's called Sandburg Village. Sandburg Village was a mixed use of high-rise apartments and low-rise houses designed to combat blight or non-desirables encroaching on the wealth to the east of there in the Gold Coast. This house is a low-rise in that development. It is technically a townhouse. It is part of an association, but I think it reflects sort of what people were trying to aim for bringing people back or retaining families in Chicago. It has this bricked courtyard interior. It has some of the sort of mid-century staples of the day, this big long glass wall that runs throughout the course of the whole living room. It has this wonderful wood staircase with a skylight at the top of it. And although there's no garage connected to this house, there is ample parking. This was a major, major need and necessity for homes built in the 1960s in Chicago. 1970s. Now, the 70s were one of Chicago's biggest population outflow decades. People started leaving the city en masse, especially middle-class residents, and absconding to the suburbs. This house is in Flossmoor, a southern suburb, and I think it is a great example of 70s architecture. It was designed and lived in by an architect that worked for Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, a very, very famous architecture and design firm. You probably know them from projects like the Sears Tower, like the Hancock Building. The 70s, sort of under Bruce Graham's stewardship, was maybe their most famous decade. This house sort of reminds me of looking at like a Skidmore design book, a retrospective from the 70s. It has sort of that like Helvetica and Bodoni informed design. A lot of focal points are bringing the inside out, which has been a trend now in the 70s for about 30 years. But the forms are a lot simpler. White walls, sliding glass doors that are not decorated with any sort of molding, no floor moldings. It's clad in this sort of beadboard type texture with a metal roof. The sort of brownish color that the wood retains is very indicative of the 70s. I think maybe a Fire Island type house or something you'd see designed by Bruce Graham in Old Town at the time. The 1980s. Now, I think when you think of 80s, this is going to be the type of house that you think of. Just postmodern, to its core, borderline, I think in some people's eyes, ridiculous. Now, this house has gotten a lot of publicity for looking the way it does, but it has yet to find a buyer after about a year on the market. I mean, some of the 80s hallmarks here include this sort of curved glass block wall. Glass block was a very popular material in the 80s, and a lot of architects sort of harken back to that sort of 30s international style Bauhaus ideal of adding a industrial type material to a sort of high designed home. And glass block, I think, is kind of the perfect material for that, because you can have light infiltration and filtering, but you can make all these kind of crazy shapes that you'll see throughout the house in glass block. The window frames are this fire engine red. The bathroom is something else. Now, the house has been updated over the years, which is kind of a shame. Just because, in my opinion, these postmodern homes, they just do not take well to modern design trends. It's either all in or it's all out, you know. Red windows and super, super loud postmodern design just don't gel well with luxury pre-finished white oak floors and white quartz, but that's just one man's opinion. The house has a pool, which, like the rest of the house, is a non-symmetrical sort of choppy design, and the living spaces in the house look over this pool. Now, you think of this type of home, you probably imagine it in Miami. Pretty rare to find this in Chicagoland. Most of the houses in the 80s were sort of transitional. I think of like Harry and the Hendersons type house that were built. So to get something that's really designed forward would have been unique, especially one that's this loud. The 1990s, like sort of the 50s or the 80s, people imagine the 1990s like a suburban sitcom set. But really the 90s were sort of marked by a return to the city especially for like bohemian types and those looking for a different type of lifestyle than what had become sort of a stale suburban experience by the 1990s. I think Bucktown is a really great example of a neighborhood that experienced this growth. As you guys know, I've talked to death about Chicago corner stores and how they sort of faded from existence. This is a real life example of this. Now, this house had been a bar up until the late 80s, early 90s, and it was bought by someone who turned it into a variation of what it is now. Now, it has been renovated again since the early 90s conversion, but the idea of taking a mixed-use space in a inherently great building and turning it into a house, to me, is a very sort of 90s Bucktown thing. And this house is on Wabansia Street, which was filled with these corner stores. And I think this is probably the best conversion of all of them. Now, the layout for some might be kind of impractical, but again, that's not a concern to a guy like me. I'm aesthetic forward, even with having a 7-month-old baby. We make it work. The 2000s. When people think of the 2000s, it's McMansion era. The late 90s, the early 2000s, you think of these sort of mashup of beloved American styles, Tudor or colonial, and you smash them together and you get this mess. Houses are a lot bigger in this era. If you were to look at a chart of the average size American home in the 1920s versus the 90s and 2000s, it would astonish you at the difference in average square footage of new construction homes. Now, this house was interesting to me because it is in the suburbs. It was a ground-up construction house, but scale is pared way down and style and attention to detail is pared way up. It is located in Winnetka. It is, instead of a big sprawling wide house, it is a vertical house, sort of to make up for the smaller lot sizes in towns that directly border Lake Michigan. And there is so much detail in this home. It has maple floors, a kitchen with a big glass window right at the back of it, which is a design staple that we used in some of the projects that we're working on. And this staircase is so cool. Floating maple stairs with a glass barrier to the living space, and on the other side, sort of a Japanese-derived light filtering shade, which has a nice glowing effect from the side. The 2010s. Now, this is going back to the adaptive reuse in the city that we started to see in the late 80s and early 90s. This is one of the craziest renovations I've seen. Super cool, pure art, pure tiny glasses, pure, I'm sitting in there with a black turtleneck, eating some sort of like endangered fish at a dinner party. And the current owner did the renovation that you see in its current form. Now, on the first level, there is this big, long gallery featuring all these really unique pieces of art and furniture This owner is a notorious collector. These big floor-to-ceiling doors open out into the courtyard, which is filled with sort of mature trees, which is really unusual. I should mention where this is. This is centered in a planned manufacturing district in Chicago, meaning that this area was previously zoned only for heavy manufacturing use. And this house is sitting right in the center of it. The only access to it is through an alley. The house and the renovations sort of pay homage to its first iteration as an industrial space. These paneled windows, the staircase is a prefab stainless steel. The bathroom vanity is a also fabricated piece of steel, which I thought was super cool. I kind of aped this design for a bathroom in my house. And then the top floor has this great sun deck with ivy covered walls sort of surrounding you. I love how encapsulated this home is in an unusual location in Chicago, and I love the attention to detail throughout. 2020s. Now, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of houses that are going ground up in the city of Chicago that are really blowing my hair back in the 2020s. So I thought we'd focus on yet another renovation. This house is one that had sort of inherently good bones from the 1880s. It was built originally in 1885, and it just underwent a massive gut renovation. I used to live on this block and walk covetously by this house as the renovation was underway. It's in Wicker Park, just situated at the south tip of the park. Really beautiful modern design, which I wholeheartedly appreciate. I am not a big fan of bringing homes back to the way they originally looked 140 years ago if all the original features are changed anyways. I think you just pedal to the metal, go modern, and make it look cool. And that's what they did here. Bonus feature. Now, if we're going to talk about the most exciting house coming from the 2020s, it's the house that I'm currently building with my partner, Alex Morsch, in Westtown. Very much in the fashion of adaptive reuse, like I've talked about in some of the other houses. We are taking what was once an old store or a bar, a dilapidated old building that was mixed use from the turn of the century, and turning it into a single family home. As much as we wanted to save some of it, we ended up not being able to save any of it. The only thing that's remaining from the original structure are the 3 walls. 2 is on the side and 1 on the back. Like I've mentioned in some of the other videos, glass and light and sort of the gradient effect of our color palette are paramount for us. We have a big floor-to-ceiling glass door pair in the back of the house and a big privacy reeded glass floor to ceiling in the front of the house, just to give somewhat of a nod to the old storefront. I love those Bauhaus international style casement window rows that you see in those great houses from the 20s and 30s in Europe. That's what the second floor is. And because this house has no basement, we're going to use the attic as sort of a less formal living space as a basement alternative.